Hi, Bernie.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Great.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast subscription. And you are Bernard Beitman. You're in Charlottesville, Virginia, because you're a visiting professor at the University of Virginia at the medical school there. And you're a psychiatrist, and you are the author of Connecting with Coincidence, a book about coincidence. The subtitle is The New Science for Using Synchronicity and Serendipity in Your Life. And I'm very interested in that, not just because I have a life, but because the idea of synchronicity, which is Carl Jung's term, I think, is one I've never been really that clear on. So I wanna in the course of this conversation delve a little into Jungian thought. I know you're a psychiatrist to some extent in the Jungian tradition. But first, why don't we talk a little about the whole idea of a coincidence? I mean, it seems like there are at least two schools of thought on coincidences. One is they're just coincidences, and any kind of meaning that we get from them, we are imposing on them. They are just random juxtapositions that happen to seem amazing, but in some sense aren't. There's nothing deeper. And then there's the view that, which I guess was Jung's view, but you can help me out here, that no, there's actually something not entirely random sometimes about these juxtapositions that seem amazing. There's something more going on behind the scenes or something.
Beautifully said, Bob. Beautifully said. Another way of saying it, the confusion of what you just tried to describe is there are no coincidences. And by that, people mean either they're random or they're caused by God. And the reason they say there are no coincidences, or they're just coincidences on the one hand, is the term coincidence implies a possible cause, but one that we haven't quite figured out. Otherwise, it's random, everybody knows it, but the juxtaposition of the two or more events suggests maybe there's a cause. But when people talk about there are no coincidences, the statistics guys say that we know the cause, they're random. Mm-hmm. And the religious people suggest we know the cause, it's God. And what I'm looking at is the possibility that there are causes, and there's a causal range that we haven't quite paid attention to with those two explanations, and that's us. That we're in between random and God. We have something to do with creating many of the coincidences that I describe in my book, and I try to be able to describe those.
Now, when you say we have something to do with it, do you mean more than that we place the meaning on them? I mean, we clearly, that clearly happens, right? And there are, I mean, is that enough of a question, or should I say more?
Please say more, because you just froze up.
Yeah, yes, so did you, but I don't think the audio recording itself was impeded. So, I mean, yeah, the apprehension of meaningful coincidence clearly involves the human brain.
Yes.
The apprehension of meaning. I mean, you can look at something and go, amazing things are going to happen if you go through life long enough. It would be amazing if amazing things didn't happen, given how often, like, symbols and things are randomly juxtaposed, right? Like, it would be pretty amazing if I was never, ever thinking about something and then turned on the radio and heard a song that seems relevant. Given the number of times I've turned on the radio while thinking of something, what would be amazing is if there was never a seemingly meaningful juxtaposition of things, right? So in that sense, if you take and I guess I'm now in the interpretive realm of kind of, it's only a coincidence, but in that sense, any meaning that I'm getting out of the coincidence is, of course, involves my brain. I'm making the meaning out of the coincidence. But if that's what you're saying, then you're still in the, it's just a coincidence school, right? And then the brain makes something of it.
There's no question that there are events that are best called random, out of which we make meaning. Mm-hmm. No question that that's right. I'm talking about even the thinking of someone and having them call one, which, as you say, there are so many intersections between events that we observe and are part of that it would be surprising if we didn't have something weird happen. The statisticians like to call that the law of very large numbers, or truly large numbers. They get us a little confused because there is another statistical law called the law of large numbers, which is provable. But it's not provable that the law of very large numbers is true, because when you take very low probability events, you have to take an infinite time span to be able to see that a thing that was very, very low probability might take place. So they get into a little trouble with their words, but the general sense, as you've described it, that you would be surprised if in all the intersections we have in life, there isn't something weird happening, that would be surprising. And they do happen, and from random events, we do make meaning.
And we'll get into that because I know you've done work on like what kinds of people are most inclined to place meaning on these intersections of things. But to try to pin down where you stand on the question of whether there are coincidences that are not sheerly random. I mean, maybe we should talk about this anecdote that you mentioned in your book involving your father, right? I mean, that seems like, do I have it right? It was
Yes.
Okay, so talk about that, because that seems like, well, a pretty unlikely thing, and I'm wondering what exactly you see in it. So why don't you tell us that story?
I was 31 years old in San Francisco in 1973. It was February 26th, 11 p.m. I was standing at the sink of my Victorian house in the Fillmore district and choking. Something was stuck in my throat and I couldn't get it out. And I had never choked like that. Something was stuck. And then it stopped. The next day I found out that my father in Wilmington, Delaware, 3,000 miles away, had choked on his blood at 2 a.m. in Wilmington, Delaware on February 27th. 2 a.m. was in Delaware was 11 p.m. in San Francisco. I began to wonder how that happened. I began to wonder if other people had experiences like this. Ian Stevenson here at the University of Virginia was here. He's now deceased. Wrote a book called Telepathic Impressions, in which he collected stories much like this, where a person, usually with a loved one, had an experience that at the same time was like the experience of the person who was having difficulty. I call it simulpathity. Pathity meaning emotion or feeling, and simul at the same time. I was on Wisconsin Public Radio talking about this just last Thursday, and one of the callers called in about one of his triplets. He was a triplet and woke up in the middle of the night with a lot of pain and distress. At that same time, he found out the next day one of his triplets had been in a severe automobile accident. These are common experiences. I have a survey called the Weird Coincidence Survey. You can go on my website and take it to see how sensitive you are to coincidences. Mm-hmm. In that survey, there's a question about simulpathity, and occasionally many people have such experiences. So the data are there that what I experienced with my father, the simultaneous choking 3,000 miles away, are common experiences of human beings. We don't want to admit it in current scientific materialism, but this suggests something like telepathy. And the interesting thing about simulpathity is the original definition of telepathy is the same as what I'm calling simulpathity, meaning pathy, feeling at a distance, telepathy, feeling at a distance. But telepathy has become much more cognitive over the decades. So a new word was necessary for the feeling part of what might be called telepathy.
Okay, so you, in this case, you do believe that this kind of thing that some people might call a coincidence in the sense of a random juxtaposition of events was not random. There is something going on there.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Now, it seems to me, I mean, you said it's too common to not to be explained by chance, but it seems to me that's a very hard problem to get your mind around. It seems one problem with coincidence generally is it's very hard to rigorously address whether these things exceed, what the laws of probability would predict. So in your case, it's certainly unlikely. I mean, if I had said when you were born, what are the chances that this person, at the moment his father dies, will feel an impulse related to the cause of death or have a feeling related to the cause of death of his father, I would have said pretty unlikely. On the other hand, if you had said, what are the chances that'll happen to someone on the planet, I would have said, oh, pretty likely, actually. So, you could just say, well, you're the person, right? I mean, and of course, I know there are other accounts of this that you've become aware of, but I'd say two things. I mean, when somebody calls into that radio show, that's not exactly a random survey, right? These are people who heard that this was going to be a show about coincidences and chose to listen, and then the subset of those who chose to call in. So it seems to be pretty hard to do the math there and figure out what that means. And the other thing I'd say is,
let me interrupt
sure.
what you're saying, because you're saying several different very important things here.
Okay.
You are attempting to do what I have attempted to do, which is determine the probabilities of various coincidences. That's not an easy task. And if you look at what statisticians have written about coincidences, they avoid that question entirely. They do not try to talk about how you determine the probability of any particular coincidences. You set up very correctly, probability speaking, the difference between anyone having a simulpathity experience and picking the person who's going to have it. The same thing is true of running into somebody while you're traveling, somebody that you know. If you say run into anybody that you know, the probability is much higher than if you pick a particular person that you will run into. So you're playing correctly with probability questions. But what I want to be able to do is first categorize coincidence into subtypes so that I can begin to approximate the likely probability variables that come into determining the specific probabilities of particular kinds of coincidences. Because there are very different kinds of coincidences, and you can't just talk about them generally. Going back to Jung, one of the problems I think you might have with synchronicity is it covers a whole range of coincidences. Very many different types, from thinking of someone and they call to simulpathity experiences, which have very different base rates of probability taking place.
Right. And one interesting thing about you're emphasizing this, what's your word for telepathy? The
simulpathity.
Simulpathity. It is that clearly is a subset that has a distinct positive explanation. In other words, what you're suggesting that maybe among kin or something, there's some kind of special relationship that's actually, I don't know whether you want to say it's really would be incompatible with the laws of science or not. I mean, one thing I've always thought is that mind reading, for example, cognitive telepathy, you might say, if it turned out it was happening, I wouldn't say that overthrows the whole scientific paradigm. I mean, we know that when people have thoughts that their brains emit waves, it's not in principle impossible that me standing next to someone could have some sensor in my brain that picks up the waves that we know go beyond their cranium. So, I guess I should pause there and say, it sounds like from something you said earlier, you're saying that if you accept your interpretation of the event you experienced involving your father's death, then that is incompatible with scientific materialism. There must be something more than beyond the scientific paradigm.
I would distinguish between scientific materialism and scientific inquiry. There's plenty of data to suggest that telepathy exists. It's just that the current materialistic paradigm rejects it, that it's not something that's acceptable, because in truth, there is no good theory about how telepathy works. But the data for its existence, both in personal experiences and out there in laboratories all over the world, including, if you would like to see the book Irreducible Mind, edited by Ed Kelly and others, and Dean Radin's book, the data are there, but there are a lot of situations that perhaps you've heard of. I find quite humorous, but very descriptive. Somebody submits an article to a journal that demonstrates that telepathy exists. And a reviewer says the methodology is great, the statistical analysis is done very well, the conclusions are drawn from the data, but I don't believe it, so I reject the paper.
Yeah. Well, we probably don't want to get involved in a discussion about telepathy literature broadly, but like, shouldn't these things be replicable? I mean, if there is a solid methodology, hasn't it ever happened that the pro-telepathy people say, look, do the experiment yourself, and someone actually does it? Or say, let's do it together, and we'll have, like, referees observing, right? It just seems like you would be able to get to the bottom of this if under specifiable circumstances the phenomenon does show up.
It's a more important question than this, Bob. As we're talking, whenever I get into this subject with people, I have to ask, what is your basic belief about the subject, and in this case, telepathy? Where are you on it? Because we can talk in all kinds of detail in response to what you just said, but it becomes a kind of like, I can say this and you can say that sort of thing. Do you have any experience yourself with telepathic connections?
None come to mind. I mean, weird coincidences happen, and they may seem meaningful. I mean, there was actually an interesting kind of thing involving my father's death, but it wouldn't be a telepathic explanation. It was just like, we had all gathered, we were all there because he was clearly in trouble. We didn't know, but it was an open-ended question at this point. He might pull through, it wasn't like a death watch, but we had all gone there. And then we all heard, I guess independently on the news, that the guy who played Ben Cartwright on Bonanza had died. Now, you have to know my family's history to know how significant that is. I mean, if you had said, name one show on TV that we all watched as a family where the father would be comparable to my father, it would have been either him or Andy Griffith, either Ben Cartwright or Andy Griffith. And we all just said, oh yeah, man, when I heard that, I just thought, oh, we're in trouble. I mean, and you have that and some of the work you've done, and we should talk about this, is about how different states of mind make you more amenable to these interpretations. And one of them is sadness, and one of them is anxiety. And you've got probably a little of both of those going on when your father is gravely ill. But, in the end, I just go, who knows? I mean, my mind is not completely closed on these matters. And, as I'm sure you've noted, quantum physics, for example, makes the physical world seem weirder and weirder. There is no doubt you are aware of the entanglement literature, right? Where seems to be something that maybe you could call instantaneous influence between remote particles. But so my mind is kind of open, but I actually don't. When you ask me about telepathy specifically, and weird coincidences get my attention. But when you ask me about telepathy specifically, I'm trying to think. I don't think I consider myself a telepath. No. I just don't think I've had a lot of those things. No.
I believe that's true. Just from the way you're talking about it, it's not something, even if it's happened, that you've noticed. The Ben Cartwright story, we can go off on that a little bit. That suggests something that I believe is true, that we live in a forest of symbols.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the question of whether those symbols have anything to do with us personally is what that Ben Cartwright and your father's death around that time made you think for a minute. How could the TV be talking to me? I mean, that's kind of the indirect question. And I'm a psychiatrist, and if you come in and tell me the TV is talking to you, then I got to give you an antipsychotic. That's what it seems like. But it turns out that a lot of the coincidences people report have to do with their minds and what's going on in the media around them. Now, you were talking earlier about all these intersections we have with the internet and multiple media inputs. We're getting a lot more symbols being thrown at us.
That's right.
So there are, I believe, a lot more coincidences being observed.
A lot more random coincidences being observed that leave the field open to interpret them meaningfully, right?
Well, how random they are and what we mean by random. Would you please define random for me?
Well, you know, it's, I mean, there is the mathematician's definition, which I can't bring to mind anyway, but I think you know what I mean is that, well, for practical purposes, what I mean is that the interpretation that, hey, given that I turned the radio on and this song was on, like I'm trying to decide whether to accept this job, right? And this song comes on about some guy who had a terrible experience at a job and got killed on the job, and I go, so I'm not going to take that job. As a practical matter, what random means is that interpretation is wrong. The interpretation that this means I'm in some sense supposed to not take this job is just wrong. I mean, that's the practical payoff of what I mean by random, right? Now, in other words, that the fact that the song came on while I was thinking about this thing is a coincidence in the common sense of that term, is what I mean.
I think it's important that you can't define random.
Well,
I think it's because most people can't. They define them almost like ipso facto, if that's the right term. They define them by what they mean, the outcome that they want it to be to mean, which means you told a story about the radio already knowing what the conclusion was going to be, that there was no reason for you to go along with what the radio said to you. What random means is that the two events are independent of each other, that they don't have anything to do with each other.
Like had I died that morning and not been around to hear the song would have still been played. That's in a way where it is not related. The playing of the song, the causal forces that led to the playing of the song are unrelated to the causal forces that led me to be having the thought I was having when the song came on.
And right here is a little bit of the story of a leader of a group of 10 people, including him, are crossing a river. And he wants to make sure that everybody gets across the river. And he gets to the other side, and he counts the people, and there are only 9 people. He forgot to count himself.
Okay, but I don't get the take home here.
You neglect the fact that you turned on the radio.
Okay. But that's the other thing I'd say is the fact that I turned on the radio is unrelated to the probability of that radio station playing that song. That's one thing random means.
The radio station was going to play that song.
Right.
That was going to happen.
Right.
You turned on the radio at the time they were playing the song.
Yeah.
I'm saying that's not random. I'm saying that there was something about you that had you turn the radio station on at that time.
Well, yeah, it wasn't a coin flip question as to whether I'd turn the radio on. Maybe I'm the kind of guy who turns the radio on when he gets in the car. That's true.
And that increases the probability that you'll find a song like it. You'll find something that might be meaningful.
Oh, sure. And that gets back to kind of one thing you're saying is that there's all kinds of things about the modern environment that increase the chances of observing a coincidence. But let me just try to get...
You still had a very good point there. You had a base rate of you being a guy who gets into your car and turns the radio on every time. And let me give you a different story from that, where the base rate of turning on the radio is much lower than your hypothetical getting in the car each time. Mm-hmm. It involves Sissy Spacek and the coal miner's daughter. Loretta Lynn had been wanting Sissy Spacek to take this role. She'd been going on the Johnny Carson show, other TV shows, saying, I want Sissy Spacek to play me in A Coal Miner's Daughter. Sissy Spacek was ambivalent about it.
Mm-hmm.
People were telling her to do it. People were telling her not to do it. So she and her husband flew to Washington, D.C. to visit her husband's mother.
Mm-hmm.
Her mother didn't know much about country music, was more into classical music, and suggested that maybe Sissy and her husband pray on it. So they prayed a little bit and got into her mother's Cadillac to go for a ride just to think about it. And her mother's radio station was usually turned to classical music. They turned the radio on, and there was Loretta Lynn singing A Coal Miner's Daughter. That made Sissy Spacek decide to go to take the part. Now, here she was at a point where she wasn't sure. This low probability event, that is, here was a country music song being played when classical music was there. How that happened, we don't know. Yes, the person who decided what songs to play had decided that a while ago. It had nothing to do with Sissy getting into the car, but the timing of getting into the car and turning on that radio was enough to turn her into a decision. One of the problems that you're alluding to indirectly is that some people make decisions based on coincidences without taking other factors into consideration. Mm-hmm. For example, a girl gets into her car. She's 19 years old. Her boyfriend wants to marry her. Her parents said he's a bad guy. They turn on the radio and a song comes on that's her grandmother, who is dead, her grandmother's favorite song. Mm-hmm. Now here, the girl took that song to mean she should marry the guy. But you have to take other information into consideration when you do that.
Now that leads to something interesting. First, let me ask just one clarifying question, and then we'll move on to the something interesting I think that raises, which is just the reason I'm kind of pressing you on this. Wait, are you saying that something weird was maybe going on with Sissy Spacek? I mean, the reason I'm asking the question is because you said you do believe sometimes these things are kind of, you might say, intrinsically meaningful in cases where what's happening is that you are remotely sensing the feeling of someone and remotely sharing the feeling of someone. You think that happens. That's not kind of scientifically accepted, but you think that happens, and that could explain a certain category of experience. Now,
yes.
Now, for turning on the radio to create intrinsically meaningful things would be that would take a different kind of explanation. Some might say, well, it's God. Some might say something else, but it would have to be different from this sharing of feelings thing. And so my question to you is, do you also, does your departure from scientific orthodoxy go beyond your believing in this shared feelings thing and thinking that other categories of coincidence too may well be, or even are, what I'm calling intrinsically meaningful? I think you know what I mean by that.
I hope what I think you mean is that we have something to do with the creating the meaning beyond randomness. Is that what you mean by intrinsic?
I mean it's in some sense a message being sent to Sissy Spacek. She's right to think, not just that she's taking it as meaningful, obviously she's taking it as meaningful, but that her interpretation is right, that this is in some sense guidance she should take, and that the guidance originates somewhere other than her brain.
Yes. And that where that other place is, or how we understand from another place, is a very, very important question.
But you think the guidance may come from somewhere other than your brain?
Well, I believe that more and more that consciousness is more than just our brain.
Well, consciousness is certainly a weird thing, and there's certainly not enough appreciation of that, I think. Let me move now, though, to the question of cases where our brain, there could be a case for taking guidance from coincidences, even if you think your brain is imposing the meaning. In other words, it's like, I think sometimes, and I'm a real noticer of coincidences, okay? And I think a lot of people are actually. I have asked large rooms of people, including undergraduates, like, have you ever been in a case when you were under pressure to make some decision? should I ask this girl out? Should I take this job? Should I break up this relationship? And some song came on the radio or something, some coincidence, and it at least got your attention. You at least went, whoa, and felt it emotionally. In my experience, the answer is 90% of the people raise their hands to that question. So I think let me just say, it's not uncommon to take coincidences kind of seriously in that sense for them to get your attention. They do get my attention. And one thing I've noticed is that, sometimes it's like I'll see something, like I'll be thinking about something and I'll turn and I'll see a book, like say a book title on the shelf. And I'll go, whoa, that's telling me not to do this thing. And then I realize, well, somewhere in my unconscious brain, I know where every book on my shelf is. If my unconscious brain wants me to turn and look and see a given book, that will happen. And so maybe what this is just somewhere in my brain, there's real anxiety about doing this thing I'm inclined to do. And it is calling my attention to all the symbolic warning signs. And maybe that's a good reason to pay attention. Maybe you should trust your unconscious. There are views that you shouldn't, but there are views that you should. Is that something that your work gets into?
That's very nicely said, Bob. I am somewhere in this unconscious, subconscious terrain between Jung and Freud. Freud had a personal unconscious, which mostly had to do with interpersonal relationships and childhood upbringing. Jung was most interested in the collective unconscious. I'm interested in the area in between that connects us to our environment, includes people around us, but in ways that we haven't yet quite paid attention to. What you just described as your subconscious knowing where all the books are and then turning your attention to the place that will get your attention best is a subset of the subconscious that I am talking about.
Okay, so we've gotten into Jung and Freud, so maybe we should take this opportunity to talk a little more about how Jung informs your thinking. And I mean, he had this idea of synchronicity, which I think he called an acausal connecting principle. So yes. not causal. I never really understood what that means. I gather it gets into his theory of archetypes, which is another thing I've not totally understood. Do you want to talk a little about what Jungian synchronicity means to you?
The two words that you're having trouble with, I have trouble with too, and I think you have to delve deeply into Jung and you still come up with some questions. What I like to think of acausal meaning is that we don't have a causal explanation in current scientific terms. That there is going to be a way to understand it that's beyond what we currently understand scientifically. I mean, the current debate in science now has a lot to do with the hard question philosophy, the question of how we experience something. We can know when neurons fire red what the neuronal picture looks like, but we don't know how to define the experience of red. That's the old hard question of philosophy. What is the subjectivity that we're talking about? And the subjectivity gets into what Jung was trying to talk about as acausal. He gets into the collective unconscious. He gets into the unus mundus. He gets into ideas that we're part of a greater consciousness and that our minds are not as separate from each other and what's around us as we tend to think. Western materialism has made us think we are just all unto ourselves. The connections among us are mostly bartering and financial. What can I get from you? What do you get from me? The emotional parts are in there too. What can I get from you emotionally? But what simulpathity begins to suggest is that we're connected in ways that we have not yet appreciated. And Jung was trying to talk about the ways in which cultures are connected, how there are common symbols in all the different cultures. And that's what he meant as evidence for the collective unconscious. You bring up archetypes. Well, archetypes are symbols that seem to go across cultures. They're patterns of thought and behavior. They're neither thought or behavior, but they're patterns by which people and cultures behave. The most common ones, obviously, are father and mother, but there are many, many others. And when Jung talked about coincidences or synchronicity, he used the phrase constellating an archetype. Now, constellating is a wonderful word because it sounds like stars and constellations. So it expands your mind just even thinking of the word. So I had to sharpen the word down and listen to other people and come to activating an archetype. So under intense emotional circumstances, and sometimes not so intense, archetypes are constellated or activated. And these archetypes, and he doesn't say it this way, but they seem to somehow, in the language he uses, cause the coincidence to take place. The archetype is then represented in each part of the coincidence, in the mind of the person and in the external environment.
So is there a specific example of that happening where could you flesh that out with an example of how the archetype is involved in and even kind of driving, in a sense, the perception of coincidence?
The best known, most famous of synchronicities is Jung and the scarab. And it's been told over and over again. So, and it's always worth repeating. Jung was seeing a young woman who was isolated in the iron retort of her own intellectualism. She was all very rational and would not listen to Jung's interpretations of her dreams and other things. Mm-hmm. So one day she brought in a dream of a golden scarab.
What's a scarab?
A scarab is a beetle-like insect.
Okay.
As she was describing this golden scarab, it was a jewel made in the shape of a scarab. Jung heard a tap, 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 tapping at his window pane. Went over to the window and opened it up, and there was a scarab-like beetle that was not common in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. He took the scarab in his hand and presented it to her and said, "Here is your scarab." The juxtaposition of the dream and the beetle, Jung said, opened her mind, and she became open to new interpretations of her life.
And what was archetypal about a beetle?
The scarab in Egyptian theology and mythology represents death and transformation.
Okay, so this was something he interpreted archetypally, and then there was this, what some people might call a coincidence of a beetle showing up. So I guess I see how the two connect, a little synchronicity and archetype. Of course, the idea of archetypes, to begin with, he interpreted in what some people might call a supernatural way, or at least, I mean, let me illustrate what I mean by giving you what my kind of default interpretation of archetypes would be. Okay, so these things show up in different cultures. You see motifs like snakes and, things involving, mothers and stepmothers and so on. I don't know what his list of archetypes is, but obviously there are themes that recur again and again in different cultures, in conversations within a culture. My explanation would be, well, we're all human beings, and of course, I'm kind of a proponent of evolutionary psychology. So I think that the mind is not just a blank slate. It's like the mind is designed to think in terms of certain categories, certainly like kinship categories. We're designed to deal in certain ways with threatening animals, and there are snakes in a lot of parts of the world, and they would scare you and get your attention, and so you would talk about them with people, and they would enter folklore. So my interpretation of just the observation of archetypes would be, well, we're all human beings, And the explanation is natural selection. It generated a kind of a common human nature that manifests itself in some ways differently within different cultures, but you would expect certain recurring things. That's what I would call a standard scientific interpretation of archetypes. But Jung set aside synchronicity for now. His kind of bedrock interpretation of archetypes was different from that, right? He was talking about, whether you want to call it supernatural or not, he was talking about it signifying the existence of something, of a form of universality we don't appreciate, some kind of universality of consciousness or something, a form of universality that that science, you might say, doesn't appreciate. Is that right?
Correct. And your interpretation, evolutionarily developing and maintaining certain patterns, and they are continued in the brains of the individuals as we continue to grow, makes a lot of sense to me, and always has. That our brains don't come in blank slates; they come in pre-programmed. My favorite one is still our ability to learn how to learn language. How amazing that is! So we come in with that. So we would come in with programs about mother and father and other things, death and transformation too. So I'm not against it all. In fact, more supportive of the way you just described the potential for archetypes than some might be. There's a funny little twist in all this. And Jung, as far as I know, and Jungians don't write about this, but he had a strong relationship with Wolfgang Pauli. Wolfgang Pauli was a Nobel Prize winning physicist who got his Nobel Prize for something called the Pauli exclusion principle. Now, Jung was Pauli's therapist for a while until Pauli went to somebody else, but they maintained their relationship. And they wrote a book together, two halves of it. First, Synchronicity from Jung, and Pauli wrote his own part. And they developed an idea of dual aspect monism, which has to do with materialism and consciousness being different aspects of the same thing, or mental and material being different aspects of the same thing, which was consciousness. But the archetypes, as you're describing, are a little suspicious because of the potential biological and evolutionary inheritance of them. But the Pauli exclusion principle raises a different question. The Pauli exclusion principle suggests that two electrons of different spins can't be in the same place at the same time. That there is something, and it's a mathematical something. It's not a physical something. It's not a brain anything, but it's a rule of the universe that in order to have materiality, or materiality results from the fact that the two different electrons and other pieces of little matter cannot be in the same place. They are excluded from being in the same place together. And this exclusion creates what we call matter. And that is a kind of an archetype. That is a form or pattern that is neither physical or mental, but a pattern in the universe that helps create what we feel as matter. Now, I think that was one of the reasons Jung was drawn to Pauli. I've never seen it written, but it strikes me as the best example I've seen of how what Jung might have meant by an archetype.
That idea that two electrons with the same spin can't occupy the same space, or
I may not be saying that correctly, and I'll have to go back and look at it. But two subatomic particles can't be in the same place at the same time. And I did the spin thing because I think I might have mixed it up with
entanglement.
Entanglement.
Yeah.
So I now stand corrected correctly.
But how is that an archetype? I mean, that seems to be kind of commonsensical. It's what I would have guessed. I mean, when I think of particles, I think of them as occupying separate spaces.
They have. Again, I can't explain it to you, and I thank you for asking me. I'll have to go back and read it again. It's been a while since I've never been able to really talk with anybody about it. So you look at it yourself. Look up the Pauli exclusion principle in Wikipedia, and you'll see that it's a little bit more than what you talk about as common sense. Because if it were so commonsensical, you wouldn't have got the Nobel Prize for it.
So I guess what we can say for sure about Jung's notion of synchronicity, to get back to that, is, yeah, he was in the school of thought that there's something more there, you might say. This is not every coincidence is a quote random in the way we, kind of mean that juxtaposition. And you are right to see meaning in them, not just in the sense that maybe it's your unconscious mind telling you something, but there is in some sense meaning infused in these coincidences from, you might say, beyond your own mind, somewhere outside of your own.
What you called inherent meaning.
Yeah, intrinsic meaning. Yeah.
Intrinsic.
So he is in that school that as a scientific materialist might put it, that school of thought that there's something weird going on here.
It's very hard for me to think of coincidences generally without including the human mind for most of the coincidences Jung talked about. So when you talk about inherent meaning, there's a bit of a problem. But there are some places where there might be some inherent meaning for those coincidences that you can look at and that I can look at the same time, that we can both stand outside of them and say, I wonder what's going on here. And one of them, and really is my favorite, is the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon are 93 million miles apart. Yet from where we stand, and again, it's important that we're included in this, from where we stand, they're the very same size. And that has to do with the ratio of the diameter to the distance between them. How is it that those two orbs in the sky appear to us to be the same size? We can both look at that. Is there inherent meaning?
Is it really the case that if you just took a picture of the two and you measured them at a really fine level, you'd get the same measurement?
Just hang around and look at a solar eclipse.
Well, that is weird. Yeah. That is pretty weird. I mean, maybe there could be a physical explanation of it. I can imagine laws of physics, but I kind of doubt it. It is kind of weird. Huh.
And you can look at that, and is there inherent meaning in that? And again, it's something that you can speculate about or turn away from. From what I've read, astronomers try to find sun, moon, planet relationships that are like this, where from the planet they would look the same size. They haven't found them. And statisticians who like to think of the multiverse will say, oh, we're in just one of many, many millions of trillions of universes, and so we just happen to be one where that happens. But this raises the question of the anthropic principle. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. But where the idea is, the classic formulation of the anthropic principle is it starts with the observation that, if these various physical constants had been slightly different, then the universe would not have enough structure for there to be life. Isn't it amazing that everything was fine-tuned like this? And then the reply is, that is kind of part of the anthropic principle, is, but wait a second, if things hadn't been conducive to the origin of life, we wouldn't be here to marvel at it. So it has to be the case that we live in a universe that is physically conducive to life. So it's not so amazing after all, kind of. That's the dialogue involved in the anthropic principle.
Why then are we here to marvel at it?
Well, the reply you get is, well, that's another question. In other words, you're saying, but you can also imagine a reality where there's just nothing and no life, is kind of what you're saying, which is true. But the reply in the anthropic principle dialogue is, the first reply is, look, you shouldn't marvel at the fact that the universe is conducive to life. If the universe couldn't sustain life, we wouldn't be here. So it's like tautological to look around and go, wow, we live in a place that's compatible with the existence of life. Well, of course we do. We're alive. Doesn't mean it's not amazing that there's life, as you're saying, I think, but...
If you look in a variety of religions, and even in quantum physics, I don't know if you've seen the photo of the diagram, but as strange as it might seem, that our consciousness is being developed so that God might be able to know himself.
Mm-hmm.
That this is the way for God to know himself, or whatever the right pronoun might be. Our consciousness becomes awareness of what is around us in a way that God wants to know.
Yeah, I think Dobzhansky, the geneticist, may be the one who said evolution is the universe becoming aware of itself, which it kind of
good.
is.
That's it. So if you want it, if you get into teleology now, if you get into is there a purpose to anything, which is another form of meaning, that part of the purpose is for life to be aware of itself. That our consciousness continues to expand. That one of the reasons we're even having this conversation is because I think all over the world, consciousness is expanding its awareness of itself. That we are being asked, and my task is a relatively small one, in the sense that rather than talk about near-death experiences, which my colleagues do, or mystical experiences, or reincarnation, which my colleagues here at the University of Virginia do, I'm here on everyday reality, where I'm trying to say that coincidences alert us to the mysterious hiding in plain sight. That behind this curtain that we call scientific materialism, there are stranger things happen than we have been able to accept up until now. And the simulpathity is one of my experiences that other people have that suggests there are ways that we are interconnected with each other that we don't recognize, of which we're not quite fully conscious. So I'm trying to be able to suggest there's more going on, and that there's a lot more going on than even what I'm able to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And this gets back to my original kind of skeptical question of like, but wait a second, isn't it so hard to formulate like the mathematical question of what would, when a coincidence truly is extraordinary, right? In other words, when it really, whether the number of seeming coincidences really exceed the number of seeming coincidences you would get from sheerly random juxtaposition seems to be such an unfathomable, hard to, it's one of these mathematical things that's in principle doable, but given the complexity of reality is impossible to do. And so that was, but we've had that conversation. Let me ask you a question that's relevant to it, which is, could you talk a little about the work you've done and looked at on how certain states of mind make us more inclined to interpret things as meaningful coincidences?
Sure. States of mind and situations in life. Transitions like the one you described with your father and being around, maybe yes, maybe no. Traveling, sickness, job loss, new births, weddings, all are transitions that tear at the web of regular reality. And I think in a way, let things in as well as alert us to more. The fundamental element of noticing coincidences is being more alert to what's going on around us. And when we're in states of alert, that's sometimes called anxious, sometimes it's called depressed, trying to look at a way out. People who are searching for meaning in life are looking around. People who are in high emotional states, who are very happy, tend to be able to think that the world is around for them, and you can get into grandiose positions and do that too far, and you become...
Right. I'll bet people in the manic phase of manic depressive illness are more inclined to see coincidence, aren't they?
Yes, and that's again why, almost like the TV set talking to you.
Right. Everything is an omen. Everything is just charged with significance.
Yeah, and I remember one manic patient who had just that experience, but she couldn't make sense out of it. Everything was charged with significance, but she was trying to see how it all fit together and was overwhelming her. And that was part of her manic difficulty. There are times when normal people in heightened states of awareness have lots of stuff coming at them almost in a way that's too hard to interpret also. But for a manic person, they've gone beyond their ability to absorb, digest, and construct, and it becomes a symptom of their mania, so of their psychiatric illness. So again, we have to slow them down. We have to slow down their thinking because they're going too fast, and we call them a psychiatric patient. So yes, seeing too many is part of being manic, and that you can get also seeing too many coincidences can make you feel that you're the center of the universe, mm-hmm. which becomes a kind of paranoid grandiosity. Paranoids think the world is all against them. Grandiose think it's all going for them. But you can see the pattern is very much the same. I'm the center of everything. People who aren't either too much in either direction and have a lot of coincidences can get caught up thinking they're the main character in life. And for them, they are. But what you end up learning is that there are other people like you, separate from me, and me separate from you, where you're the main character in your life story, and you are the center of your life story. But so am I the center of my own life story. And so all we're doing is seeing our own life story reflected around us. And what I'm most interested to do is how Bob and Bernie can put their life stories together in a movie that makes for greater harmony than we have now.
Okay, well, I'm up for that. I'd love to see myself in a movie. After all, I am the center of the universe, and I deserve to be. Hasn't happened yet, though.
It's just the way we want to have people start thinking. But the next step then is to recognize that I am a player in your movie. That I am in your movie.
Yeah, well, as long as we keep saying it that way and don't start acting as if Bob is a player in Bernie's movie, I'm on board, sure.
Well, I'm going to tell you Bob is a player in Bernie's movie, too. So that's the kind of adaptation to each other that we need to be able to do.
Let me ask you a question about whether... Okay, so it's an interesting observed fact that certain states of mind make us more inclined to actually take guidance from coincidences, I think. And whether that points to a sense in which this could conceivably be, as biologists say, an adaptation. In other words, something that natural selection inclined us to do, because you said, okay, being sad and being anxious incline you to accept guidance from coincidences. Well, you could argue that in both of those cases, I mean, there could be two things going on, right? You could say, as we suggested earlier, that, when you're anxious, I mean, maybe your unconscious mind is processing more than you're processing consciously, so it can present the conscious mind with good guidance in the form of by calling attention to these things. And that could be the case both with anxiety and with sadness. But the other thing about those two conditions of anxiety and sadness is even if the unconscious mind isn't going to present you with particularly good guidance, you could argue that in both of those cases, any guidance is better than no guidance. So if you were like almost paralyzed by sadness and depression, any kind of plausible path forward, yes, you should call this person, is probably going to be better for you than continuing to be mired in hopelessness. And with anxiety, if you've been dithering for several days over a decision, just flipping a coin is probably going to be better for you than continuing to dither if it's a big and important decision. So I'm suggesting two separate possible adaptive explanations for why we might seize on coincidence sometimes. One is it's your unconscious mind, actually, the fact your unconscious mind can give you good guidance, and the other is just that any guidance is better than no guidance. For either of those reasons, natural selection might have inclined the brain to seize on coincidences and take guidance from them under certain circumstances.
I ask you to look at my Psychology Today blog, where I have 4 or 5 different posts on statisticians and probability and coincidences. You see a more extended discussion of those.
Okay.
The one that is going to come out at the end of this month will be on the evolutionary adaptation ability of coincidences, because what coincidences allow us to do is question whether there's a connection between what appears to be two events coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can find some underlying cause for that, that helps us understand the world better. And we've been doing that for centuries, for millennia. If one thing happens and another thing happens, if I see a footprint here of an animal and then the animal's over there, then I can make those connections. It's no coincidence between that footprint and the animal actually existing, as a simple example. So that's a coincidence. Is there a connection? Yes. And there's an animal that I can figure out is correlated there. So sometimes we can find causes for correlations. And that's why we're alert to coincidences generally. They help us in the way you just talked about. But as I listen to you, I suggest that the way you're thinking about coincidences is very consistent with another New Yorker, or a New York guy up the street from you, where you are now, named Gibbs Williams. Gibbs Williams was a Jungian and has pretty much rejected Jungian thinking and wants to explain coincidences as the human brain's attempt to solve difficult problems, just in the way that you're talking about. And so he uses Freudian thinking, psychodynamic thinking, to explain coincidences, much in the direction that you're going. And I think they explain a subset of coincidences. I think Gibbs is onto something for a subset of coincidences. I have several examples like that in my book. I call them counseling by coincidences, where the person looked at a circumstance as a way of helping them decide something that was a difficult problem for them to decide, in much the same way that you just did. So Gibbs and you would have a very rich conversation should you decide to talk with him. I think there's more in addition to just I make it up and I look at my environment and find symbols. I think there's more we have to do with creating them in addition to the telepathy part, more than just I take a set of symbols in my environment and interpret them in a way that I need to be able to interpret them. I think we do that. And I think you described that very well. But I think there's telepathy, and there's something that I call human GPS, which allows human geospatial positioning system, which is a way that we have in our brains and minds to be able to find our ways to people, things, and situations that we need. And we don't know how we do it, but we get to where we need to go. I think this human GPS gets us to turn the TV set on at a time that we need it. And I had a great example of that for me when I was writing about human GPS based on many stories that I've got where people end up in places that they needed to be and don't know how they got there. And I was trying to figure out how that might work. So I was bored and confused while I was typing. And I went to the New York Times, which I do fairly regularly online when I'm bored.
Yeah.
Want to get a little different idea. And right there on the front page, I don't do it every day, and but I do it regularly. Right there on the front page of the New York Times was two Scandinavian researchers who found what they call place cells and grid cells in the brain, in the parahippocampal gyrus, the cortex near the hippocampus, that allows rats to be able to define where they are in three-dimensional space. So we have the capability of knowing where we are, and you would think we do, but we didn't know we did, that we know not only where our bodies, where our hands and head are through human proprioception, but we also know where we are in three-dimensional space. And what I was adding, that in ways that are like simulpathity, we also know where we need to go, where there's something out there that's important for us. So that human GPS capacity allows us to know where we are and then know also how to get where we need to go.
Well, yeah, but that seems a long way from what you're positing in the case of coincidences that are telling you where to go. That's right. I mean, that's like, sure, we know where we are in 3D space, but you have to posit a whole nother mechanism if you're going to argue that that coincidences are a message about where to head next, right?
there's a whole body of research in parapsychology, so it's ignored, called the psi-mediated instrumental responses, PMIR. And it's by Rex Stanford, who's been the major guy who is doing it. And it's been even ignored within parapsychology. But Rex Stanford has been able to show through his research that we can know something about where something is that's important for us to know and guide us to go there or avoid it. And I'm not going to try to argue with you about this, because I think it's a concept that'd be difficult for the way I understand your thinking to be able to understand, or accept, rather, not understand, but accept. So I'd rather not try to go into that. I just want you to know where I stand and where our differences are, and where my differences are also with Gibbs Williams, who fits much more closely with you.
I think, you know what, you and some of the telepathy researchers you decided should do. Find like a really rich person who shares your view. I'm sure they're out there, who will offer some significant sum of money if skeptical scientists will come together and do these experiments that you say are now kind of confined or kind of discriminated. The findings are kind of like consigned to kind of a publishing ghetto or something, you know, because people, the mainstream journals won't take them seriously. And just offer people money to do these experiments under supervision of multiple parties, right? If they're clearly replicable, we should see the results.
Have been replicable. They are replicable, and they have been shown. It's the difficulty in accepting. Ed Kelly here at the University of Virginia and our DOPS group have two books, Irreducible Mind and Beyond Materialism, which just came out last year, which show data and have theories about what we're talking about, much more beyond what I'm talking about.
Right, but he did the experiments. What I'm saying is, why don't you get some of the skeptics, you know, somebody to pay them to go through with the quote believers and do the experiments together, so that they couldn't, if you're right, they couldn't deny the results.
There's something called the experimenter effect, that skeptics of telepathy, for example, tend to score below chance. In other words, they're worse than chance in telepathic experiments, so that if you don't believe it, you perform worse. You kind of bias yourself in the other direction.
In other words, worse than you would do if there were just no effect at all. So they are...
Here's random.
Yeah, okay.
People who are into it are higher than random. People who are very skeptical are lower than random, which again is statistically significant. So that what you believe affects affects the telepathic experience.
But of course, what they would say is it works in both directions, and that explains the pro-telepathy results. That's the reply. You would hear.
Yeah, that's right. So what I'm doing is not trying to put together any more scientific experiments. I simply wanted to show that coincidences are common, as you have shown with your class, the students, and asking them about.
The perception of meaningful coincidences, I think, is pretty common.
Well, I just wanted to show that. I mean, I wanted to have data, and I wanted to be able to define the kinds of coincidences that seem more common. There's an article recently in The Atlantic by Julie Beck that put together data in a different way than I did about common coincidences. So we established that there are coincidences, but what I'm doing is not trying to appeal still to the scientific establishment. That's what Ed Kelly and our group are doing. They're trying to marshal the data and give cogent arguments. And I suggest, if you want to read any of it, and they're big books, but there's a lot to them, and the data looks good and the arguments looks good if you give them any chance. What I'm trying to do is go to the general public. I'm trying to say to the general public, as I'm able to do many times, thank you, people tell me, for confirming that what I thought was a strange experience, that I thought was crazy, are really much more common than I realize. And then thank you for helping me understand a little bit about how they work. The general public is a kind of crowdsource to be able to suggest to those people who are already have these experiences, that they are much more common and that they are part of an evolving consciousness that is demonstrating this capacity.
Okay, final question, and I'll just let you answer it, and then that will be the last word. Doesn't, we've mentioned that certain states of mind make you more amenable to attributing significance to coincidences. Certain states of mind make you less. It's also true that drugs can have this effect, right? I mean, LSD, marijuana probably. So what we know is that the chemistry of the brain can move you all across the spectrum as to whether you are, you assign credibility to these things or not. And doesn't that give you, in a certain sense, more cause for skepticism? Because it's like, who's to say what brain state is doing the math right, so to speak, in terms of trying to figure out whether these things are happening more often than randomness would predict? I mean, doesn't that just make you feel that whatever state your brain is in, there's just kind of no way of knowing whether it's in a position to do the math right? And then I'll let you answer, and that'll be that.
We pretty much end where we began. Your perspective is much more brain-based. Mine is much more consciousness-based. And I've come to this slowly over my life, that I will turn what you said around, that the brain is kind of a filter for consciousness, that we need, as manic people and psychotic people can tell us, we need to be able to filter information that's around us, lots of stuff going on around us. We can't pay attention to the proprioception information that's our brains are processing in a really fast rate. We can't process all the stimuli and stuff going on around us. Our brains modulate what's going on around us so we can deal with it, so that we can be bipeds managing ourselves on Earth. So rather than the brain being the end all and be all of what we're trying to measure, the brain is a reducing valve that reduces a lot of consciousness to something that we can manage. And when you take something like LSD or marijuana under the right conditions, that reducing valve is opened to more consciousness, to more information, to a higher reality, a deeper reality that's around us all the time, which mystics have described many times and in somewhat similar fashion.
Okay. Well, thank you. This is very interesting, and I could keep talking because it is so interesting. But maybe on another occasion we will continue the conversation. But meanwhile, your book is Connecting with Coincidence, the new science for using synchronicity and serendipity in your life, by Bernard Beitman, which is you. You write a blog for Psychology Today, I gather, and you have a website called coincider.com, right?
Yes, and Facebook called Connecting with Coincidence, and I'm on Twitter also. So I like to talk to people on Twitter. But for you particularly, I really hope you look at the Psychology Today blog, the ones on statisticians.
Mm-hmm.
Be interested to see what you think about those.
I will do that. All right. Well, thanks, Bernie. And
thank you, Bob. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Same here. Take care.